The late 1980s to early 1990s were an odd time in U.S. automotive history, and one of the things that kind of came out of this era was a new era of personal luxury coupes and convertibles. These particular models included vehicles such as the Cadillac Alante that was introduced for the 1987 model year and continued on through 1993, the Buick Riata as well that was introduced for 1988, and continued on through 1991. And you have over in the Chrysler stable, the Chrysler TC by Maserati that was produced for the 1989, 1990, and 1991 model years. Of course, there were other personal luxury coupes that I didn't quite mention, but these are some of the predominant ones of the era. And of them all, I have to say that the Chrysler TC by Maserati is likely the most disappointing. I mean, you have to think of the premise here. Let's take a car that is kind of made in part by Chrysler and made in part by Maserati and throw it together. It doesn't really sound like it's a recipe for success. Nor was, by the way, the Cadillac Alante, where the body was made by Pininfarina and then the engine and transmission and the chassis was engineered by Cadillac. But this Chrysler TC by Maserati was born out of a vision of Lee Iacocca, who knew Alejandro de Tomaso from Iacocca's time at Ford, hence the de Tomaso Pantera of the 1970s. But by this point, de Tomaso was actually head of the Maserati brand, and the friendship between Iacocca and de Tomaso birthed the wonderful TC by Maserati that perhaps was as confusing of a car to customers as its very odd Maserati trident embedded in a Chrysler Pentastar logo that it employed up front. Now, unfortunately, only a little over 7,000 of these TCs would be produced over the 1989, 1990, and 1991 model years. By the way, I believe all the 1991 model year cars were actually produced the year before that. And effectively, Chrysler had to meet the minimum volume requirement for the contract with Maserati, and that's why they ended up producing, I think, 7,300 of these. Otherwise, they probably would have stopped short of that because the car was kind of an unmistakable flop. It retailed for about $33,000 to $35,000, depending on what particular model year TC that you were able to buy. And that would be the equivalent today of about $86,000, $87,000 base price. So this was a very expensive car for the era, and the only option was a CD player. You could drive your TC with the top down like you see here. There was a soft top that you could fold up, and then there was the removable hard top, very similar to what the Alante had. So a customer had a choice of various ways that they could enjoy their TC. And I think one of the most common ways that you see them is with the removable hardtop on them with the distinctive porthole windows. Now, I have to say, I'm not quite sure why Chrysler and Maserati decided to have the removable hardtop with those porthole windows, probably for visibility, but it certainly had shades of the 1950s era Thunderbirds and the way that they looked back in the era. So they really took what I would say was a typical styling trait from Ford and then appropriated it onto the Chrysler product. And maybe that was because Iacocca himself obviously worked at Ford and just understood the Thunderbird heritage and wanted something similar and thought that it looked good. Iacocca was known for, let's just say, sharing his design philosophies with the various design teams and was unashamed to do so. After all, he was the mastermind behind not only the Mustang, although that really wasn't a design that Iacocca championed, really just the overall planning and the size of the car and the philosophy of the car, although he did dictate a less stiff C-pillar on the car to designers, as told by David Ash, who was the principal designer for the Ford Mustang. But Iacocca did actually give his, let's say, design input for the Mark III, where he effectively said, put a Rolls-Royce grille on the Thunderbird, and that really set Lincoln ablaze in terms of their sales and exceeding Cadillac when it came to the Mark IV years and the Mark V years, where the Mark IV and V just sold extremely well. And that was really because of Lee Iacocca and his designer's eye. But I don't think the designer's eye necessarily worked on the TC. And as a consequence, like I said, the removable hardtop got that porthole. Now, I'm dwelling on the porthole because there's a little known fact about that porthole and the glass within that is pretty interesting. And that is that it actually could burn the carpet inside the car. Burn the carpet, you say? Well, yes. This is what ends up happening if you park your TC in the sun and the portholes have not been covered with some sort of a tinted film, which was one of the ways that dealers would remedy this issue. But effectively, the beveled glass that was in those portholes would act as a prism. As a consequence, when the sun would shine through it, you risked that it would concentrate the rays on the carpet like you see here and burn it. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you do if you're procuring a TC is to ensure that the area behind the driver and passenger seat where you see this carpeted area is not burned, and also that you have some sort of a tinted film on the porthole window. Otherwise, you risk this happening, and as you can see, this is effectively ruined. You're going to have to take the carpet out and replace it, and that would just be a shame. It's going to be hard to kind of take that out and costly to do so. It's much easier if you don't have one that's burned up to just put some sort of tinted film on the porthole. Or you can elect to drive it only on cloudy days, or drive it with the removable hardtop off and just with the convertible top down or up. But one of the things that I have never seen on any other car, including the 55 through 7 Thunderbirds, from which the TC, I guess, took its inspiration, I've never seen a car in which the glass basically creates this issue where you have almost a self-immolating car if you're not careful. Now, apparently over the TC's lifetime, there were multiple runs of the porthole windows in the side there, and apparently the second one is the most problematic and has the most issues when causing this problem. The third run is actually okay and has a frosted edge around the glass, and that really helps with attenuating this particular issue. So Chrysler eventually did get it right, but they got it right relatively late. And if you have a low-mileage car or you're looking at buying a low-mileage car, it might be the case that it doesn't have, let's say, the third run of windows that aren't going to create this issue. So just buyer beware. Now, why in the world would somebody want to buy a TC by Maserati in this day and age? Well, they're kind of, a cool piece of automotive history, as unsuccessful as they were. Many people just bought LeBaron convertibles. There's no reason why you could really pay more than double for a TC by Maserati for really not much other than the badge. You did get a very sumptuous leather interior, and leather basically clad everything. It was hand-stitched leather. These cars were fabricated in Milan, Italy, very similar to the Elante that had the so-called world's longest production line. But the TC by Maserati interiors were hand-stitched leather. Leather adorned everything. The seats were very Maserati-esque. The steering wheel is kind of an interesting design. Later, they would get the airbag wheel from Chrysler that, looked the same in any Chrysler product. But in general, I would say the interiors were a nice place to be. Under hood, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. You could get a manual transmission in your TC. You could get an automatic transmission. The early variants had a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder making 160 horsepower. Then they came out with some variants that had the 3-liter Mitsubishi-sourced V6 under hood. Kind of seems weird to have a Mitsubishi-sourced V6 in a Maserati. And then the most powerful variant was a 4-cylinder that was assembled by Maserati, and it had a Cosworth head. It had monolith pistons, and various different internal components, and it made 200 horsepower. Some people call it a Maserati engine because it says Maserati on the top of the engine, but really it had many different components and it was assembled by Maserati. Unfortunately, only 500 cars got that particular variant. The rest of the 7,300 car run was either outfitted with the 2.2-liter turbo four-cylinder in the first year or the Mitsubishi V6 in the latter two model years, 1990 and 1991. Now, in addition to that unique engine, you did get some unique content on your TC. I already mentioned some pieces about the interior, but the wheels were also unique to the TC. I believe they were cast by a company called Fond Metal. And additionally, on top of the wheels, you had unique shocks by Sachs, and a couple other little doodad items, too, that,
let's just say they weren't worth the price that Chrysler was charging for the TC. In any case, I wanted to point out, and I think this is one of the strangest and most bizarre features of any car that I've seen. The glass, like I said, can just burn the carpet on your TC by Maserati. And perhaps it's somewhat befitting of the car because it's, like I said, a nearly self-immolating car. I don't think any of them ever caught on fire, but I guess it could. I don't think it gets hot enough to do that, and the carpet isn't flammable enough. But it's just kind of a befitting tribute, let's say, to the TC because it just flopped so significantly. Chrysler spent an alleged $600 million on this project and certainly didn't return anything. They basically lost all of their investment. And it's unfortunate, but I guess what did you expect when you take effectively what looks like a LeBaron, at least in terms of the styling, and then try to slap a Maserati badge embedded into a Pentastar at the front of the vehicle. But such is the TC by Maserati. And well, at least you got a standard Infinity 10-speaker sound system as well as stainless steel door sill plates for the money that you spent. So you got a few things, but certainly nothing relative to the cost that you would have to spend. Nowadays, you can pick up mint condition TCs for, let's say $10,000 to $15,000. They're really unloved. Elantes, believe it or not, are starting to pick up a little bit in the collector market, even the Riatas. But the TCs really haven't gone anywhere. And I think that's just because they don't have all that much special about them unless you have one of the 500 cars with that 2.2-liter, 200 horsepower engine, as I mentioned before, which are very, very rare. And then I think the other piece is just the reliability. If you have one that's outfitted with the Mitsubishi V6 and the Ultra Drive transmission, you have the typical Chrysler failures of the era where the transmission gets stuck in second gear and you have to rebuild it. So there's just a number of quality little niggles, I shouldn't say little, some more significant issues associated with this car as well that I think kind of hold its collectability down. And it's not all that good looking of a car. But hey, if you got one and you like it, go get one. Whatever floats your boat. Maybe you can have a cool car for a cheap price that nobody else has at a car show and enjoy it. Why not? I have plenty of cars that many people laugh at. It doesn't matter to me. You just enjoy what you want to enjoy. Thanks again for watching.